All right, everyone. Today we're going to be diving into one of the most essential behaviors in all of animal life, and that is foraging. So, foraging is how animals search for and obtain food. It's easy to think of this as a simple, everyday behavior, but from an evolutionary standpoint, it's one of the most powerful forces that shapes a species' adaptations. Every animal, from a bee to a bear, faces a fundamental challenge: how to get enough food to survive and reproduce while minimizing the costs like time, energy, or exposure to predators. Over evolutionary time, these pressures have led to some remarkable strategies, from things like tool use in crows and chimpanzees to the way that predators will optimize their hunting routes, or how herbivores will balance food intake while also avoiding the risk of predation. In this lecture, we're going to be focusing on how foraging behavior can be understood through the lens of an evolutionary optimization. In other words, we're going to look at how natural selection has fine-tuned the ways that animals forage to maximize their fitness. Now, before we dive deeper into the theory, let's take a quick look at the incredible diversity of foraging strategies in the animal kingdom. Some animals feed on other animals, and these are known as carnivores. Other animals feed on plants, and these are herbivores, while some animals feed on both, and these are known as omnivores. Frugivores specialize on fruit, granivores focus on seeds or grains, and insectivores feed primarily on insects. Lastly, scavengers consume dead or decaying organisms. Each of these feeding strategies really reflect the evolutionary adaptations that are specific to specific ecological niches and different resources that are available to organisms. Now, let's start by thinking about how animals determine what is and what isn't food. Have you ever tossed a stick to a squirrel, or maybe like a seashell to a seagull on the beach, only to watch as it approaches, looks at the item, and then doesn't really try to eat it, even though sometimes those food items look like something that they would eat or maybe resemble something that they would eat? Well, one idea that determines or explains how an animal knows what to and what not to eat is known as search image theory. And so Tinbergen, who actually came up with those four big questions that we talked about earlier on in this course, proposed that when animals repeatedly encounter a certain type of food item or a prey, they begin to form sort of an internal representation of what that prey or food item looks like. And over time, as the animal gains experience, this image becomes more detailed and precise, and it allows the forager to sort of spot the prey more efficiently and learn what to eat and what not to eat, and can even find it when it's camouflaged or hidden out of sight. And so researchers have actually tested this idea using blue jays, which sort of feed on these various different types of moths, including the peppered moth, which we talked about when we talked about how evolution can shape physical traits. And so in this experiment, scientists presented blue jays with an image of a moth against sort of different shaded backgrounds. And so at certain levels, like level 2, the moths were a little bit easier to see. But then at higher levels, the moths were very, very camouflaged. And so it showed that in their experiment that over time, the blue jays were able to detect a particular type of moth with more and more experience. And so on the screen, you can see that it's nearly impossible for us to see the moths at level 6. However, the blue jays, after a lot of experience, had very little difficulty detecting the moths at level 6. And so this shows that experience can really shape perception. Their brains were really fine-tuning the search image to match their prey type. And it really demonstrates that learning and experience can directly influence what an animal is able to search for and look for when foraging. Now that we've really talked about how animals identify food, let's look at how they decide what to eat and how long to search for it. So there's a theory that we're going to discuss here in a second about how animals decide when to forage, how to forage, where to forage, that stuff. But before that, let's just sort of take a step back and think about our own eating habits. So who here hates grocery shopping or cooking dinner after a really long day? I know I do, and I'm probably not alone. And so that's exactly why a lot of people use services like DoorDash, Uber Eats, or Factor to have meals delivered directly to them. You see, cooking takes a lot of time and effort. You have to buy groceries, you have to prepare the ingredients, you've got to cook, you've got to clean up, and sometimes the energy and time spent just aren't worth it compared to the convenience of ordering in. Now, of course, ordering also comes at its own cost of money, but it saves you a lot of time and effort. And so, in a sense, that's us making a foraging decision. We're weighing the costs, like time, effort, money, and maybe even the possibility of burning our own dinner, against the benefits, which is getting food quickly with minimal work. And so animals face the exact same kinds of trade-offs in the wild. They have to decide how to get the most energy possible while spending the least amount of time and effort. They're not exactly spending money in these instances, but for humans, that is a particularly important resource to consider. And so that's the foundation for what is known as optimal foraging theory. And so optimal foraging theory, also known as OFT, if I refer to it in that way, is one of the key frameworks in behavioral ecology. It's based on the idea that natural selection should favor foraging strategies that maximize an animal's net energy gain per unit of time. Now, if you think about it, finding food is time consuming, and so that's exactly why we have those companies. But of course, foraging isn't just free, it involves trade-offs. Animals must balance the energy that they gained from the food against the energy that they spent searching for it. And as well as for things like time required, the risk of being eaten, all which may come at a cost to themselves. And so the word optimal doesn't mean perfect decision making, right? Even humans aren't perfect at making decisions. It simply means that over evolutionary time, behavior that leads to higher fitness payoffs tends to be favored and becomes more common in a population. So the optimal foraging theory helps us to really make predictions about what animals should do under certain conditions, which prey that they will pursue, how long that they will stay in a certain area, and when they will switch between different food types. And then we can test all of those predictions with observations from experiments to see how species align with optimal foraging theory. I do want to sort of highlight here that we're not really going to get too much into the quantitative aspects of optimal foraging theory, although that is a really important part of this theory. But I really just want you to know that optimal foraging theory is really important because it applies to all animals. From chimpanzees to insects, it's really thought that these animals all adhere to this theory, making it one of the more fundamental concepts in behavioral ecology. So now we're going to really explore three of the domains where optimal foraging theory helps us to understand how animals are making the foraging decisions that they're making. All right, so the first domain of the optimal foraging theory is the optimal diet model. And this is also sometimes called the Krebs model, but basically it addresses a simple but critical question. What should an animal eat? The model considers three main variables when deciding whether a food type belongs in the diet of the animal. The first is energy value, which is basically just how many calories or the energy that a food provides the organism. The second is encounter rate, which is how often an animal actually comes across the food, right? So for example, caviar in human diets is quite a rare or low encounter rate, whereas we can go pretty much anywhere and get a slice of pizza. The third variable is handling time, and this is the amount of time that it takes to capture, kill, or process the food. In terms of humans, that's how long it takes to get the food delivered, how long it takes to go drive to get the food, how long it takes to gather the ingredients, prep the meal, cook it, and clean up, right? So these are all the sort of variables that come into the optimal diet model. And so using these, we can actually calculate the profitability of each food item, which is essentially its energy to handling time ratio. The food with the highest profitability will always be eaten first. And so this model can be applied broadly. Any animal deciding between two or more food items can be analyzed in this way, helping us to understand why certain dietary strategies evolve throughout species. And so here's a real-world problem of the optimal diet model in what it looks like using the model species known as the great tit. This is one of my favorite animal behavior experiments because it reminds me a lot of those like sushi conveyor belt restaurants. I don't know if you've ever been to one of those, but they're quite entertaining and a lot of fun to go to. But basically what they did is the birds were placed in front of a conveyor belt containing two different sizes of mealworms. And so these represent the two different prey types. The researchers controlled basically how often the birds encountered each size of worm. and then also accounted for sort of the energy content and the handling time of each. And so using the optimal diet model formula, the researchers predicted that when the birds should take the most profitable prey compared to when they should take both prey types. And what did they find? So the model was actually really supported. It was the encounter rate of the most profitable prey, not the least profitable prey, that determined whether the birds included the smaller prey in their diet. So if you look at these graphs here, you can see that the green bars represent the larger, more profitable prey, and the orange bars represent the smaller prey. The top axis shows how often each prey type was presented, and so you can see that when both prey items were rare, the birds really were willing to take both types of prey. But when the larger, more profitable prey was abundant, the birds focused almost exclusively on the larger prey, which is exactly what we would predict in the model. So again here, you don't need to memorize this experiment. I'm not going to quiz you on it, but the key takeaway is that it's the encounter rate of the most profitable prey item, or in our case, right, the most valuable, most highly desired prey item, that can determine in animals whether an animal includes those less profitable items in their diet. And so, and that is exactly what the optimal diet model would predict. All right, so let's move on to our second domain of optimal foraging theory, and this is the marginal value theorem. This model is all about a different question. How long should an animal stay in a food patch before they move on? So if you imagine a hummingbird sipping nectar from a flower, or maybe like a herd of deer or cows grazing in one valley, the forager will be feeding, but the patch will slowly become depleted over time. So the rate of food intake will then also, as a result, slow down. Meanwhile, other valleys or other food patches or other trees are available, but there's a problem, right? Moving to those different patches comes at a cost, right? You have to spend time traveling to those different food patches. You lose time that you could be spent feeding at the current patch, and also moving from one place to another, if you're a prey item, could result in really high predation risk. So Charnov's marginal value theorem predicts gives some sort of predictions about how foragers should make a trade-off between the current patch that they're in and deciding to move between into different patches. And so prediction one is that a forager should leave a patch when the marginal rate of food intake in that patch equals the average rate of food intake across all other patches. And this is also while accounting for travel costs. So basically, in simpler terms, this is a mathematical way of saying stay until the patch is not giving you more than what you could get elsewhere while accounting for travel costs, right? That makes sense, right? You want to stay where you are, maximizing your food intake while accounting for travel costs. Prediction two is that the longer the travel time between patches, the longer a forager should stay in the current patch. If moving takes a lot of energy or time, right, this makes sense. You want to maximize food intake before leaving and going to a different patch. Lastly, prediction three, which is a little bit more counterintuitive, and I'm going to explain why that is, states the following. If patch quality is poor, a forager should actually stay longer in that patch than they do in a rich, abundant patch. And why is that? Well, because it needs to spend more time there in order to achieve the same net energy gain that they would obtain from compensating for travel costs. And so this model really gives us a clear framework to predict when an animal should leave a patch, balancing both the energy gain of foraging and the cost of moving. And so let's look at this in an experiment. So here is sort of a fascinating experimental test. Basically, researchers built these artificial trees with these numerous numbers of branches, and then they attached these like little baskets that had sawdust in them that were hiding certain types of food, certain numbers and size of different mealworms. Once again, kind of very similar to the conveyor belt. The experimenters then could calculate the rate of food gain for different patches, and then they manipulated sort of the travel time between these patches by manipulating how easy or difficult the baskets were to open, right? So some lids were really easy to open. Those represent a really small amount of travel time, and others were really, really difficult to open, and those represented a sort of a long travel time. And so under these conditions, the researchers calculated the optimal time a bird should spend in a patch based on travel costs as predicted by the marginal value theorem. And then they sort of, so that's that red line on the graph there. But then they actually measured and observed how long the birds spent in each patch. And they found that it closely represented the line that the marginal value theorem would have predicted. And so as time travel increased, birds spent longer and longer in each patch, exactly what this model would predict. And so this experiment really is nice because it provides strong evidence that foragers are making decisions that maximize net energy intake, taking into account both the patch quality as well as sort of the travel costs or handling time associated with each patch. All right, finally, let's look at the third domain of the optimal foraging theory, and this is risk-sensitive foraging. This was originally proposed by a researcher with the last name of Caraco. This model basically asks a slightly different question than the previous two. Basically, it wants to know, should animals take variability into account when they're choosing between patches? And so here we're talking about the term risk, and so risk refers to variability in food availability. Right, so imagine you're an animal and you're choosing between two patches with the same expected food intake. In patch 1, the animal will always get 8 food items, but in patch 2, there's a 50% chance of getting 16 items or a 50% chance of getting absolutely nothing, right? This high risk, high reward thing, right? This is the same kind of decision that humans encounter all the time, right? Think about insurance. Do you take the insurance plan now, and even though you may pay money into it every single month and never ever use it, or do you take the risk and say, well, maybe I'll pay nothing, or maybe I'll have sort of a catastrophic accident that could really, really financially ruin me, right? So these are sort of decisions that humans have to make all the time in terms of risk, right? We do it with money, we do it with investments, we do it with gambling, right? These are all things that are really, really pertinent to human decision making. But animals make these kind of decisions in terms of foraging all of the time, right? And so the question remains, of these two patches that I just described, which patch should the animal choose? Well, one idea predicts that the answer depends on an animal's current energy or hunger state, right? So this is known as the energy budget rule, and according to the energy budget rule, if the animal is satiated or full, right, it's recently eaten, it should tend to sort of be risk averse, right, and avoid those low variance, or avoid the high variance patches, sorry. And if the animal is very hungry, it should tend to be more risk prone, favoring the high variance patch with sort of a hope of a big payoff. And so one question though is why? Why would an animal that is really, really hungry kind of risk it for the biscuit and try to find this very high risky, high reward patch? Well, the idea is that if you're very hungry, you're sort of on the brink of survival. You need to make some sort of last-ditch effort to survive, and in order to do that, you go to these high-risk, high-reward patches. And so, while some research does support this idea, it's not universal. And so I'm going to go over sort of two examples, one that really supports the energy budget rule and one that's actually from my own research that does not really support it. And so let's go ahead and dive into that real quick. So this is sort of a foundational experiment that kind of helped to solidify the energy budget rule as a factor in animal foraging. And so basically they tested this bird called the yellowed-eyed junco. The birds were presented with 2 trays of bird seed. Once a bird chose the tray, then they basically saw what was in there. And so one tray had a fixed amount of 5 seeds every time they selected it, whereas the other tray had a variable amount. They either had 0 seeds about half the time or 10 seeds about half the time. And so both trays had the same mean value of 5 seeds, but the variability or the variance in what the animal was going to receive on any given trial is what differed. And so Caraco and colleagues calculated the utility functions of the birds, right? And so what they found was that hungry birds had concave utility, which means that for each item that they could receive, that item was worth more and more to them because it was essential to their survival. Therefore, they became risk-prone and preferred the chance of a larger payoff, right? And so we see that here on the left graph. In comparison, the satiated birds had a convex utility, meaning that each additional item that they received was actually worth less and less, right? So they basically were wanting to be more risk averse, preferring the consistent tray. And so that shows that they were being, avoiding the risky tray because they just wanted to make sure that they had food to continue at their current state. So the results of this experiment with the birds really matched the prediction. Hungry yellow-eyed juncos chose the risky tray, while the more satiated yellow-eyed juncos chose the fixed, consistent, safe tray. And so it is really important to remember, though, that, like I said, this is not how all animals behave. Risk-sensitive foraging appears in some species, but others don't really follow this hunger versus satiation pattern, likely due to other constraints like ecology or cognitive limitations. And so I'm going to really highlight this through a study that I recently conducted. Here are the results from this study. I tested 3 beluga whales on a very, very similar paradigm, except they weren't receiving bird seed. They were actually receiving fish at the values of 0, 4, and 8, right? And so the safe option always provided the belugas with 4 fish, whereas the risky option provided them with either 0 fish 50% of the time or 8 fish 50% of the time. So if you see on this graph, those teal bars represent the morning testing sessions, which means that they were more hungry because they had not yet had their breakfast, whereas the gray bars represent the afternoon sessions, which occurred after they had already eaten lunch. And so on the y-axis, we see the proportion of trials in which they selected the risky variable option, with a 1.00 meaning that they always chose it, and a 0.00 on the bottom of the y-axis representing choices that they never selected it. And so here we can see that for belugas, their satiation did not seem to play a role in their risk-sensitive decisions. Yes, there were 2 whales that preferred the consistent option when they were more satiated, which would align with the energy budget rule. But you see that these animals already preferred the safe, consistent option. So their satiation wasn't really flipping or reversing their preferences, right? And so this study is not alone either, right? There are many other studies that suggest more large-bodied animals don't really need to change their behavior based on the variability or risk of a payout. And instead, it seems like the data is suggesting that only smaller-bodied animals, like those birds or insects, may align with the energy budget rule. And the reason this probably is the case is because the larger bodied animals have a lot more energy stores. And so they're really less likely to be in these really, really hungry, starving states. They can rely on their energy stores and not have to sort of rely on variability to sort of make their decisions. That's one hypothesis, at least. And so that's why we believe we're starting to see it only sort of in small bodied animals and not so much in the large bodied animals. All right, so we've seen how animals make foraging decisions to maximize energy intake and balance risk, but not all food is simply found in one's environment. Some species have taken foraging a step further, actively cultivating their own food. So let's explore one of those remarkable examples in the leaf-cutting ants that actually farm their fungus. And so if you ever travel to South America, you will inevitably encounter these leaf-cutter ants. They're really remarkable. They crawl all over the surface of the forest floor, and they basically chop off parts of leaves, and then they bring those parts of leaves back to the colony. Now, if you're unlucky like me, sometimes they will actually even mistake your clothes, your underwear, or your socks for leaves, and then you'll wake up one morning and find that your socks have sort of a bunch of holes in them. And so I hope anyways, that did happen to me, and so I hope the ants in Argentina enjoyed my socks as much as I did. But I did not really appreciate having a bunch of holes trying to be out in the field in Argentina in my socks and then having to hike around. But anyways, I always thought that these ants were actually bringing the leaves back to eat them, kind of like the vegans of the rainforest, right? Making these beautiful Caesar salads out of these little leaf cuttings. But it turns out their gut microbiome actually cannot digest plant material. Instead, these ants use the leaves to feed a garden of fungi that they keep stored in their colonies, right? And so they will then basically nurture and cultivate and raise this fungus, and then they will eat and consume the fungus just like we do with our plants and with our farming, right? And so although we've been farming for like 10,000 years, the ants have actually been doing it for millions and millions of years. So we were not the original first farmers. Now, this behavior is way more complex than it looks, though, and keeping these fungal gardens really healthy is not an easy job. For example, the whitish gray crust that's often seen around these ants is actually sort of a mass of bacteria that produces an antibiotic that specifically targets fungal parasites, right? So the ants will groom their gardens consistently and remove the infected fungus. They sort of carefully collect the parasites and place them in these pockets on their bodies where those antibiotics can then kill the spores before they can kind of spread to the rest of the garden. And so it's really, really complex behavior shown by a very, very itty bitty, tiny little insect, right? That basically through the combination of like a cultivation, hygiene, and sort of biological defense or biological warfare against parasites, these ants can really maintain a very highly productive fungal garden within their own colonies. Basically, they make a mini farm of foraging, of creating fungus that they can then consume. And so if you really want to sort of dive deeper into this example, there's a great video that I'll link in the description by PBS highlighting sort of the amazing evolutionary example of mutualism between the fungus and the ant. Now, some other foraging happens in animals, includes food caching and scavenging. So I'm going to really just briefly touch on these examples. And if you have more questions, feel free to reach out to me via email. So food caching is when species like squirrels, chipmunks, or even certain birds will store lots and lots of food items. Now, to retrieve these caches successfully, though, animals need to have a very highly developed spatial memory, right? And so researchers have been long invested into how in the world these animals remember where they store their food. And so they've looked a lot into sort of brain structures, and they found that the hippocampus, which is often associated with memory, appears to be sort of the key structure in these animals that cache their food. So, for example, there's been studies that compare corvids, different species of corvids like crows and ravens, and they found that the species that cache have very large hippocampuses, a very large volume of hippocampal neurons, whereas the corvids that don't really cache food have much smaller hippocampi. So it's really interesting. A lot of people say that animals don't find their cache of food, and oftentimes animals do not always find their cache, but a lot of times these animals are really, really good at it. They would not continue to cache food for long-term storage if they were not able to find it. It wouldn't make any evolutionary sense. So so that's food caching. And then the last example I wanted to highlight was scavengers, right? And so there's a little bit of a trigger warning on the screen, so if you want to look away, there's a dead animal. But basically, scavengers are any animals that feed on dead or decaying organisms rather than hunting live prey. And so scavengers can span many groups, mammals like hyenas and coyotes, birds like vultures. I'm sure anybody who lives in Georgia or in the southeastern United States has seen turkey vultures on the side of the road, but even insects can be scavengers as well. And so their role in the ecosystem as a scavenger is really, really critical. And so by consuming carcasses, scavengers can recycle nutrients, and they can help control diseases that would often spread through the contact or consumption of decaying matter. And so foraging as a scavenger comes with sort of its own set of trade-offs, right? There are other scavengers, so you've got to compete with other scavengers. For turkey vultures, right, a lot of times eating roadkill means you're being put in danger, not by predators, but by other vehicles, so those sort of anthropomorphic challenges. And then also, there's sort of a need to sort of detect food efficiently, right? Because normally predators are good at finding living prey, but dead prey is often sort of aversive, maybe smells bad, all those sorts of things. And so an animal that scavenges has to really have a system that is evolved and adapted to detect those kinds of things. And so in many ways, scavenging is just sort of another example of how evolution can shape foraging strategies. And it all, once again, involves trade-offs, minimizing costs and risks, just like sort of the other behaviors that we've discussed today. All right, so we're going to wrap it up here. Across this unit, we've seen foraging is one of the most fundamental challenges that all animals face. They need to know how to get enough food to survive and reproduce. And so every animal faces the same problem, but they sort of solve it in remarkable and different ways. Some hunt carefully, some scavenge, some store food for later, and some even farm to create their own meals. And so what unites all of these strategies is trade-offs. Choosing the most profitable food might save energy, but it could really expose you to predators. Staying in a patch longer might maximize intake, but it costs time and increases risk. And even farming fungus or storing caches really requires energy, time, and maybe even cognition or memory to sort of remember these things in the long term. And so, just like sort of predator-prey interactions, which we're going to talk about in the next lesson, the environment isn't static. Food availability, competition, and risk can really vary constantly, forcing animals to continually adapt their strategies to be able to find food. And so it's, once again, an evolutionary arms race to the finish line. And there's not really sort of a one strategy beats all. It really depends on what's available in your environment and the strategies that you need to take. And so in the end, successful foraging isn't just about having the perfect decision. It's about making choices that are good enough today to survive and reproduce tomorrow, and then adjusting to find your next meal for when you need to. And so I hope you really enjoyed this lecture. I know it was a bit long, but I really hope you found it helpful.